Thank you, Michael. It's always a joy to be with you in cyberspace as in life. And it's an honor to be in company with all of you watching. And it's a real personal triumph to be finally sharing this exhibition, which has lived in my imagination for longer than my 2-year-old. I originally began planning it in 2018 as part of Yale's celebrations of coeducation, including the 50th anniversary of coeducation in the college and the 150th anniversary of the School of Art. When Beinecke was invited to plan something in conjunction with those celebrations, I proposed this exhibit, not because we particularly have a lot of Yale women represented in the collection, but instead because I wanted to showcase the many theater women represented in the collection, most of whom I would say are undersung. I also wanted to highlight many recent acquisitions of exciting collections relating to women in theater, including the papers of performers Maureen Stapleton and Goldie Russler, contemporary playwrights Paula Vogel and Sarah Ruhl, and modern playwright Maureen Dallas Watkins, who wrote the play Chicago, on which the musical was based, and many other small groups of materials. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the many people whose efforts it has taken to mount this exhibition at Beinecke, and the many friends and colleagues who have lent their time and expertise to this effort. A fuller list of these credits is on the webpage for this exhibit on Beinecke's website. Since 2018, I have had the extraordinary help of 3 graduate student research assistants, Elizabeth Wyatt, Sophie Greenspan, and Harriet Reichfeld. There are guest contributions in the exhibit from Elizabeth Wyatt, Isaac Scobie-Tall, Yale College class of 2020, and the matchless, the irreplaceable Susan Brady, longtime archivist in the Yale Library system, who retired from Beinecke in 2020. Carrie Sancombe, Megan Chekai, and Sarah Davis are responsible for exhibit production. And I also thank the incredible work of our colleagues in conservation and exhibit services in evaluating and treating items in the exhibit. Megan Mangum is our ingenious graphic designer. For their conversations about aspects of the exhibit, I further wish to thank Tom Bowles, Susan Brady again, Lindsay King, Nancy Kuhl, George Miles, Michael Moran, and Tim Young. And finally, the Access Services Department at Beinecke, without whom we would not be able to view anything, let alone plan gigantic exhibits. I'm going to try to keep my remarks today pretty brief. I'll give a bit of an overview of the exhibit and share just a few examples, introducing you to some of the extraordinary and not well enough known people in it. Brava, Women Make American Theater, showcases through archival materials the ways in which women in the United States engaged in the production and reception of text-based stage performance over its long history. So you'll see a little bit of opera. You won't really see any film, but so it's mainly, theater as such. Far from offering a comprehensive account of women in theatrical enterprises, Brava highlights how stage performance often mirrored, but also frequently challenged and changed understandings of women's roles and of women's rights in larger US society. Drawing principally on materials in the Yale Collection of American Literature and the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters, the exhibit explores how theater served as a site of women's entry into public audiences for the arts in the 19th century, an entree into the arts as professions in the 20th century, and a locus of calls for diversity in the arts in the 21st century. Okay. An outline of the exhibit hints a bit at the variety of approaches I've taken, from thinking about the scene or the context of women's theatrical performance to thinking about opportunities available to women to participate in theater making. And throughout that section on roles, and then into this section I'm calling Her Name in Lights, I'm thinking about how to highlight these really noteworthy women, most of whom, I'll repeat, are virtually unknown, and many of whom are the subject of significant archival research collections at the Beinecke. The last case listed here acknowledges challenges to a fixed idea of woman as a gender. It invites us to consider what it is we mean when we talk about women by way of thinking about gender and performance, which have long been seen as intertwined. The case takes examples of cross-dressed stage performance that were collected by Laura Bailey, a human rights activist and collector. Brava captures intriguing moments of intersection between US women's and theater history, and there are fascinating resonances across this history. It should come as no surprise, and yet needs to be said, that women were behind innovations in musical theater, choreography, experimental writing, design, acting, theater management, and more. Some of the most interesting echoes to me are the emergence and eventual prevalence of the idea that the theater audience was predominantly female and the impact that has had on content. The rise of community theater and theater education at the university level, in which women were heavily involved. And the changing mores around female bodies, which in the 19th and 20th centuries was mainly conducted around legs. Like the performer you see here, popular cross-dressed roles, generally referred to as breeches parts, were introduced in part to expose the legs of women performers, which has such incredible implications and contradictions in terms of gender expression. One of my favorite examples of an innovation and its subsequent reverberation throughout American history is here, in a tale of two kick lines that appear in the exhibit, staged about 60 or so years apart. The kick line lies at the intersection of race, class, gender, and stage performance, as well as of American industrialization, popular cultural history, and sexuality studies. The one on the left is an early example of this formation in vaudeville theater, where as an innovation, it owed a great debt to the French can-can, as well as elements of Black American dance. It would be incorporated into segregated all-white musical reviews, like those of Florence Ziegfeld's Follies, and perhaps its most famous practitioners, the Radio City Rockettes, which didn't begin to integrate until the 1980s. The kick line on the right is a part of Wendy Wasserstein's 1977 play, Uncommon Women and Others, which was, by the way, her MFA thesis at Yale School of Drama, in which the students of the Women's College perform a number titled, We're Saving Ourselves for Yale. By the time it appears in Uncommon Women, the kick line has become a kind of shorthand for a moment of coalesced, coordinated exuberance, solidarity, even capitulation to the status quo. Appearing here, it is in some ways meant to parody the place of this formation in performance by women. We see a kind of irony in the way the women are meant to defy the kick line's traditions of precision and standardization. They are clothed according to various character types from the 1970s. They are not in synchronization. But there is a way that the kick line's introduction in Uncommon Women answers back to kick lines from the teens and 20s with something more like homage than parody. And that's especially evident in the expressions of joy on the performers' faces in both photographs, except for Glenn Close in the back there. I also hasten to point out that the kick line never doesn't have elements of irony. The era in which it emerged is full of complexity in terms of its aesthetics, who is imitating or borrowing or stealing from whom, to paraphrase performance scholar Daphne Brooks. Bonnie Clark, the director of this troupe, the one on the left, was what was then called a female impersonator. And female impersonators appeared in many of his chorus lines. So there is always a kind of gender irony going on as well. A major challenge of this exhibition was not so much of trying to tell a single story about women and US stages. I'm never really trying to do that. I'm really comfortable with the small and the local, and less so with the overarching and totalizing. But I did worry constantly about the perception that I would be trying to tell a single story, and therefore leaving plenty out of the story. Let me say that I am not trying to tell a single story, and that it wasn't possible to include everything or everyone I wanted to include. Brava embraces a multiplicity of stories, recognizing that for each of these individuals, what it meant to be a woman, what was at stake for women's rights or for feminism might be different. I want to stress that Brava is incomplete as a story, and that its omissions are suggestive of gaps. These could be and are gaps in Beinecke's collecting practices, but they also could be and are gaps in recognition for many performers and forms of performance, and gaps in the historical record as we have identified it so far. And this is especially true for women of color, trans women, and where Beinecke's collections are concerned, theater being performed outside the sphere of New York. Because I find it hard to generalize about women, I will take the remaining time to talk about 4 specific women, each with one of the many roles performed by women in the act of making theater. In so doing, I will touch on just a few of the objects in the exhibit from which you might extrapolate to the other kinds of things you can expect to see. A 1936 article called Theresa Helburn, the co-administrative director of the Broadway producing company, the Theater Guild, the top man on Broadway, and top man was in quotation marks in that headline. Helburn was one of the most influential women in American theater, even though her name is less well known today than many of her noted collaborators. There is not even a full-length biography of her, which I think is scandalous. Born in New York City, Helburn graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1908, studying for a master's degree at Radcliffe. While there, she took George Pierce Baker's English 47 workshop at neighboring Harvard. Helburn's one of 2 women featured in the exhibit to have been Baker's students. Baker would leave Harvard to help found Yale's drama department, which would eventually become Yale School of Drama. Helburn began working as a theater critic, signing on as a play reader for the budding Theater Guild in 1919. Before long, she was co-administrative director, and in her role as co-leader of the organization, she shepherded experimental productions like R.U.R, which is an acronym given in English as Rossum's Universal Robots, a dystopic Czech play that introduced the word robot into our lexicon. And by the way, the costumes and the technical direction, both for this production, were done by Kate Drain Lawson, another figure featured in the exhibit. Under Helburn's leadership, the Theater Guild also staged Eugene O'Neill's later plays and premieres of George Bernard Shaw. And I didn't end up including any of these, but I encourage you to look at how Helburn managed and tolerated Shaw, who was a real pain in their correspondence with each other. Helburn was behind drawing room comedies like Philip Barry's Philadelphia Story, the Guild's first major hit, starring Katharine Hepburn and running on Broadway for over a year. She was the first to cast husband and wife Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine as co-stars in 1924. And perhaps most memorably, she is credited with matching Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II for the first time to create the landmark musical Oklahoma. In this photograph, you can see Helburn sitting sort of behind the piano as Oscar Hammerstein auditions singers for Oklahoma. And I think the composition really visually captures her role. She is there, she's in the middle, though not at the center, and she is also not the focus. This photograph was part of a feature in the magazine Good Housekeeping called Good Housekeeping Finds Out What Goes On in a Casting Office. I mean, if only Theresa Helburn was what we think of when we think of what goes on in a casting office. Helburn's correspondence in the Theater Guild archive is voluminous to the tune of hundreds of boxes, and you will see some of it in the exhibit. She also made a project of cultivating emerging playwrights, which can be seen in her planning documents for a playwriting seminar and a playwriting competition. And by the way, one of the judges in that competition was Antoinette Perry, the namesake of the Tony Awards. The photograph with which I began, and one of my favorites in the collection, is of actress Rose McClendon, who, like Theresa Helburn, appears in multiple places in the exhibit. McClendon specialized in playing long-suffering wives and mothers. I could point out here that many roles available to women to this day are defined by their relationships with men, whether wives, mothers, sisters, or daughters. And this persists even though the critique is also well-known and commonly accepted. McClendon starred on Broadway in dramas written by white Southerners, including Paul Green's In Abraham's Bosom and Dorothy and DeVoe's Hayward's Porgy, which would be adapted by the Gershwins into the famous opera. She also appeared in Langston Hughes's play Mulatto. In 1934, County Cullen, another Harlem Renaissance poet, adapted Euripides' Medea specifically for McClendon, and she's pictured here in costume for that show, though it was postponed and never realized because of her ill health. McClendon's dream was to create a Black theater in Harlem, and she realized it when she co-founded the Negro People's Theater with Dick Campbell in 1935. Their first performance, to a reported audience of 4,000 at Manhattan Casino, was an all-Black cast production of Waiting for Lefty, the Clifford Odets play. In a letter to Langston Hughes on view in the exhibit, McClendon writes, quote, "I am sure we have at last started a Negro theater," unquote, echoing her curtain speech on opening night. Then ailing with the lung disease that would claim her life at just 52, McClendon praised the left-wing movement for giving her the theater she had longed for, saying, "If I die tomorrow, I will die happy. At last, we have a theater of our own." She tells Hughes she wants a full-length play from him for their next production. She also hints that she wouldn't mind a little more leftist content. "Something pink, if you get what I mean, and I think you do," she says. The Negro People's Theater itself was fairly short-lived, but it had a lasting impact, particularly because it prompted the planners of the Federal Theater Project to invite McClendon to advise on how to employ out-of-work Black performers. It was McClendon's suggestion to create dedicated Negro units in about 20 US cities, greatly expanding opportunities for Black theater workers throughout the United States and creating a lasting tradition of Black community theater. The New York unit of the Federal Theater Project was responsible for a production you may be familiar with, the now infamous all-Black cast production of Macbeth, directed by Orson Welles. Though she always played mothers, McClendon never had any children of her own. But the Negro units of the Federal Theater Project were a remarkable legacy. Irene Sharaff was a costume designer for over 60 stage productions and 29 films. She is best remembered for her color sense. She loved pinks and oranges especially, and for her grand scale. Many of her designs included hundreds of costumes. Even if you're not familiar with the name, I'm guessing most of you will be able to conjure a mental picture of one of her designs just from the list I'm about to give. The modernist painting inspired dream ballet at the conclusion of An American in Paris, the jewel-toned silks and hoop skirts of The King and I, the hip windbreakers and colorful crinolines of West Side Story, or the gold feathers, gauzy robes, and custom jewelry of Cleopatra. And those are all films that Sharaff designed, but she also designed the New York stagings of those productions as well. And we just kind of happen to have in her papers more of the designs from the films. Sharaff began her career as a fashion illustrator before apprenticing at Eva Le Gallienne's Civic Repertory Theater. Sharaff is one of many individuals in the exhibit connected to Le Gallienne's leadership, and Le Gallienne is also herself featured. Sharaff thoroughly researched and conceptualized every component of all of her designs. Even the blue jeans in West Side Story were specially constructed and dyed to showcase the dancer's movements. Sharaff's papers were just transferred to Beinecke from the design department of the School of Drama in 2018. And so in learning more about her, I've been amazed by her deep research and commitment to authenticity. I also love the degree of specificity and detail in her designs. Many of them have construction recommendations, specify the size of polka dots down in coin sizes, for example. And of course, many retain swatches. She also left us an entire collection of fabric swatches. Many of the shows Sharaff designed are now questioned for their use of racial and ethnic stereotypes, including West Side Story, The King and I, Flower Drum Song, and others. I think we would be right to wonder about and investigate the extent of Sharaff's complicity in perpetuating those stereotypes. At the same time, in the exhibit, I wanted to showcase her research for King and I was drawn to it in part because I am Thai, my mother is from Thailand, and that musical is banned there, not so much because of its racist stereotypes as because of the country's strict lèse-majesté laws. So as someone who grew up watching a lot of stock musical theater, which I did at the St. Louis Muni, for anyone who knows it, I had this funny relationship to this show in particular, because I watched it be more or less revered as a great work of art and its stereotypes largely not questioned. So I have to say, I admire the lengths Sharaff went to in her research. She befriended an American importer of Thai goods and through him obtained photographs from the Royal Archives in Bangkok. She studied Thai ceremonial dance costume, got samples, and investigated how to reproduce those costumes. In her library, portions of which are part of the collection here, you'll find books about Thai history and culture. I'm not saying that this redeems The King and I, because that's not really the question I want to be asking. I've been really interested in the responses to the new film version of West Side Story. And if you asked me if I thought The King and I should still be performed now in community theaters and stock and on Broadway as recently as 2015, I would say no, to tell you the truth. But I think there is a lot we can admire about Sharaff as an artist, while we also remember and wonder about and learn about race in American musical theater in the mid-century. It doesn't hurt that the beauty of the designs invites us further into that story to better understand that history. Lastly, I wanted to include Alice Childress here because she is one of my favorite playwrights, and she is in the exhibit, even though very little of what we have related to her has been digitized, so I don't have a lot to show you. Her extraordinary backstage tragicomedy, Trouble in Mind, first produced in 1954, just received its first ever Broadway production in an excellent staging at the Roundabout Theater that I hope will win all the awards. It just closed, but I encourage you to see this play if you ever have the opportunity. It's amazing. Childress began her career as an actor with the American Negro Theater in the 1940s. She grew frustrated with the limited roles available to Black women performers and began to write her own plays. So I should just point out that Childress is this great mirror to Rose McClendon. Not only is she revising the kinds of roles that hemmed in McClendon, but the American Negro Theater as a company was directly inspired by the Federal Theater Project. Childress loved to turn her sardonic eye on the theater itself, nowhere more brilliantly than in Trouble in Mind, which satirized white racial protest plays, method acting, and pious liberal directors. This is the program from the original production of Trouble in Mind at the Greenwich Mews Theatre. Childress's plays are brilliant and complex. Her characters are self-contradictory, and she was sometimes too. The exhibit features ephemera from her work with a group called the Committee for the Negro in the Arts, whose membership also included Lorraine Hansberry and the very recently late Sidney Poitier. And a script from her play Wedding Band, a love-hate story in black and white, which challenged taboos against the portrayal of interracial love on stage and screen, to the extent that Childress struggled to have the play produced. A television version was censored by some Southern affiliates, and took years for it to be produced in New York, where it was eventually staged by Joseph Papp at the New York Shakespeare Festival. Childress is the only woman I've mentioned today who has a biography, a short one by Lavinia Jennings that is nevertheless very useful, but I still think she should be more of a household name. So there's lots more to see, and I hope that at least some of you will be able to visit us and have a look. I know my brilliant colleagues will also be releasing some videos of portions of the show online, so you can look there. And I have a plug for the online speaker series we've planned in conjunction with the exhibit. I wanted to have these conversations because I wanted to hear these brilliant thinkers talk about these ideas, which I think warrant a lot more consideration. So I hope you want to hear them too. The first session will be on Tuesday, February 8th at the lunch hour for us here on the East Coast. We'll have a fantastic pair of scholars who are also theater practitioners, Danielle Bainbridge, who is writing a history of 19th century disabled performers who appeared in so-called freak shows, and meanwhile considering what the archive allows us to know and understand about these figures. And Kate Bredesen, a historian of experimental theater who is in the midst of the Herculean project of editing the diaries of Judith Malina, the co-founder and director of the Living Theater. They're going to have a brilliant conversation, so please check it out and sign up if you're interested. You can always get to this information from Beinecke's homepage too. And by way of conclusion, I just want to say that I hope the exhibit will inspire you to know these women, maybe to know some other women who aren't represented here, but could be found out about elsewhere, to see some theater, maybe even to put on some shows of your own. Archivists sometimes describe the life of the materials they steward as having a second life in becoming resources for research. I hope that this exhibit might return many of these figures to a second life, particularly amidst a period in which so many theaters have gone dark or struggled to remain open. In a preface to her posthumously published autobiography, appropriately titled Curtain Raiser, an ailing Theresa Helburn remarked on the pleasure of reflecting on her career, suggesting that to remember was almost like the experience of theater going itself. She wrote, "Best of all, I felt again the ever-recurring thrill, the heart-rousing moment when the house lights go down and the footlights come up. Brava invites you to remember." Thank you.